All right. Zero ends. Welcome again to another edition here on the Zero Ends stream, live stream. I go by name Zero Ends here. Today's stream will be part 2 of the title above, and the title of this stream is "Black Woman Sold Out in," I think, history. Check, make sure. Yeah. Yep. Black woman sold out in slavery. Yeah. Part 2 of chapter 1. If you're new to the Zero Ends channel, please always hit the red button, the subscribe button, and hit the top bell for uploads, mostly live streams here on the Zero Ends channel. There's no other social media right now besides the YouTube channel of Zero Ends. So if you like it or hate it, leave a comment. Always transparency is key. We all know most social media, especially YouTube, will not share such things like this, but we keep going because the message is important nonetheless. And as you know, I'm advocate of always, and I mean always, putting out pretty decent content. As y'all know, the few books that was given out throughout this small channel so far is in the archives. I'm not sure if I left any links where you can get the book or find any version of this book. This book particularly that I'm having trouble is finding the digital version of this book. So to those that I would say have a heart, leave a comment of where I can find the actual full version of this book, PDF, in the comment section. I'll look into it. As you know, today I don't have my good friend Miss Queen's Virtue Chanel Shalom, but me and her will be back doing this. But for now, I'm probably gonna wing it out until otherwise. So let me see everything else I put out here. Let me check some things. Just checking some things right now, guys. Be patient. And the purpose of this book is to really see if this was really the cause of the black people's problems in regards to black women and their, I guess, treacherous ways of sell you out in slavery, and probably more. But nonetheless, this is something to really examine firsthand. All right. So this is very long reading, so we're going to have to get started. Oh yeah, it's a lot. So let's begin, people. And as y'all know, if y'all catch last stream of this episode, we've gone through this. So I'm probably gonna give more of a clearer breakdown here. But no further ado, let's go on. While in the beginning to make sense, the Gall family were interested in letting their daughters marry Danish men. Another question is why the Danish men choose to pay the bride's wealth and go through a Caesarean ceremony. The most important reason was probably that the God kingship group expects them to do so. The men of Christianburg could probably have made or do with a steady relationship to a woman who would take responsibility for their well being and to help them both survive and trade. But to get this, they'll have to agree to the Caesarea. Now, I think Caesarea, if we remember, is some small, ceremonial thing, possibly. I have not really gone into detail the definition. I'll highlight it. And maybe further, I'll give you more detail on that. This idea that they had to get married to get to have a long-term relationship with a woman. Now, remember, back in those times, people don't sit there do dates, relationships, or anything of lengthy like how we do in modern era, where people take, let's say, 2 to 5 or 10 years with a woman, and eventually, if the person have no options, will decide to marry their chick. And at that time, when you're not married to most women, even here in the West, you are actually at more high risk creating what we call a baby mama, aka a single mother. Where was that? Long-term relationships with a woman cannot have been foreign to them. Hold on. Okay. In Denmark, extramarital sexual relationships could be severely punished, and though such relationships were still not uncommon, the Danish men who came out to Africa must have been familiar with marriage as the only official recognized venue for sexual relationships. This, of course, does not mean that they were actually looking to get married in Africa. Okay. But when and if the Gall family insists on a Kasar ceremony, they were permissible permissible, not surprised. Most of the men of Christianburg were single when they arrived and were therefore, in the eyes of the Danes, legally free to marry. They were young. Most men who worked at the fort were in their early 20s. Some highly assistants or men who came out in Africa for the second or third time were more than 30 years old, while some soldiers were sent out right after the confirmation and had only just turned 14. Among the married men, only a very small number brought their Danish wives with them, unlike other Northern European trade companies. The Danish West Indies and Guinea companies had no rules against European women following their men to West Africa. So there's no rules back then. But the companies did not encourage their employees to bring their wives, and married men received the same wages as unmarried men. The few men who did bring their wives were therefore governed or chaplain who could afford to support a European wife at Christianburg. Let me get my highlight here. And for those that's watching, listening, please, and like always, I always advocate, share the stream, like the video, all that good stuff. And I'm doing something here. Okay. And let me keep my mouse here. And actually, I'll have to put a thumbnail after this. Okay. A relationship with a god woman was likely an easy choice for most young men at Christiansburg. Even a what they call rudimentary studies of the social world of Christiansburg would suggest that Danish men situations at the fort could have been personal and psychological reason for wanting a long-term relationship with a woman who was well viewed or well versed in local cultures and languages. Daily life at the fort was characterized by what they call abysmal living conditions and high mortality. Many men died soon after their arrival in Africa, which they should, because back then when the Europeans were starting to get a footnote in the certain parts of the continent of Africa, they did not live pretty long because of the climate and the environment. As you know, throughout Western or what we call world history, Europeans have made some travels and find themselves in a trick bag, personally, where a lot of them, some of them did when they got to new land, either here in Africa or any part of the Western world, did die of unnatural causes or plagues or what, even more some of the environment was more harsh in the system. The mortality rate among Europeans in West Africa was extremely high, and almost every appeared to have been sick at some point during his stay. Danes were used as a high mortality rate in Denmark in the 18th century, and yet they were acutely aware of the health risks of being situated on the Gold Coast. One example of the constant awareness of the main depths at Christiansburg is Captain Johannes Rask accounts. Rask meticulously records every death at the fort, which was part of his job at the chaplain. But he also commented on the many deaths, and when he got sick himself, he noted, however, that in the beginning, to feel weak, and since we times and again heard of so many European dying, I often thought completely seriously about or thought of about death. 1 second, people. 1 second. All right, I am back. All right, continue on. Where was I? Even for men in good health, though, being stationed in Africa was a trial. After 6 o'clock at night, the company employees were to stay inside the closed quarters of the fort until the morning before expansion of the fort in the 1740s. Christenberg consists only of the governor rooms, a chapel in the middle of the fort, and few smaller rooms in which all assistants and soldiers live. And the company's ideals was to have around 20 men at a fort at a given time, one governor, high and lower assistants, bookkeepers and coopers, barbers, surgeons, some carpenters, sergeants, what do you call it, corporals, and few soldiers and chaplain. But it's seldomly possible, and I mean seldomly possible, to keep up with the mortality rate and keep all positions filled. The men did not always stay inside the fort in the evening or night, but when they did, they spent evenings drinking, playing games, and quarreling. The books from the secret council, as well as letters from the chaplain at the fort, often refers to disagreements between employees. Many of them, or many of these, took place while at least part was extensively drunk and out of control, and companies' records and travel accounts note that drinking habits among the men at the fort caused them both social and work-related problems. Some men were dismissed from their positions when they failed to fulfill their responsibilities, while others become sick from drinking. A lot of drinking back then. A whole lot of drinking, people. A whole lot of drinking. And moving forward, continuing. According to Ludwig Romer, the Danish assistant drank punch, brandy, or called brandy, water, lime juice, and sugar. Do they mix these drinks back then, man? Because it look like they're not drinking some hard liquor. Look like they're drinking one of them soft, sweet ass shit. They drink some nowadays. Anyway. Most like their English counterparts or contemporaries on the Gold Coast, while the poor Danish soldiers and workers drank straight brandy, scappled, or pinto, a beer brewed from mullet. Romer reports that Danes lacked the proper constitution for drinking punch, and therefore they could be hungover for up to a week after drinking it. He also notes how the men at Christenberg pressured one another into drinking. If someone refused to drink, he was considered a obstinate and an evil person, and apparently it was prestigious to drink or to get a drunk as one could as quickly as possible. In the 17th century, Jean Barbot had also noticed that the habitual drinking at what they call Christenberg, and suggests that the Danes were more prone to sickness from other Europeans in the coast. Now, have you ever what really hurt it and almost white? Well, it took out a whole portion of other indigenous people was the Europeans, because when they travel into other countries, they leave not only their habits, their behaviors, and their sickness, but certain disease that falls from them because of their genetics, most likely, is spread through other indigenous people that's not really the same genetically. So you also would get sick back in the time, being around other racial groups at that time. And that's not something that was hidden history. That's actual history. You can find in many books. The Danish men might have been accustomed to drinking excessively before they came to Africa contemporarily. Danes and other Scandinavians did consume a great deal of alcohol. Drinking could also have been response to the heat and the social environment of Christenberg. Life at the fort must have strained even the most stable personalities in 1786. Paul Insert tied the excessive drinking at Christenberg to the lack of other social activities, and there is no question that it must have been an extensive, stressful experience to live at a little fort, buying enslaved people and keeping them captured in the dungeons before selling them to European slave ships. In any case, the reason is suspect that the men who came out were less well adjusted even to their native environments than average Danish males. The Gold Coast was on the very bottom of the hierarchy. The Danish overseers permissed and not a place to go, and one had any other client or colony, to go to, or even better, a chance to stay in the state administration in Copenhagen or Copenhagen, if that's how it's pronounced. Um, let's see what's here. Copenhagen. Let me do this, guys. The hell is this? I'm getting distracted with this. I'm probably to close down some. I'm probably to close down some things. Yeah, let me do that. Cause this is stupid. All right. All right, guys. All right. Drinking probably did not help in a stressful foreign environment in 1688 when Gunner Thomas Benzin asked permission to Cassar or Cassirin. He had already been founded or bounded to another African woman for 3 to 4 years. What they call Benzin insists that he had to marry someone else because the woman he was with consumed everything he had, and he would starve to death unless he could marry another woman. Governor, what they call Frenchman, concluded that the would once again turn a blind eye to what Benzin did, since the man was usually drunk on brandy before 7 o'clock in the morning and caused them trouble in Christenberg. Benzin wedding was set for the same day. In case of Gunners, Benzin survived on the coast was permissible, closely connected to the marriage to a woman who could take care of him. Danish men lived at Christenberg, shaped by stress caused by boredom, drinking, and slave trading, were further troubled by malaria, or what they call climate fever, as they call it, diarrhea, guinea worms, other infections, and tropical disease, as well as general constraint of living in the culture, but was fundamentally foreign to them. Though they heard stories about Africans before they left Denmark or on boards of ships on their way to the coast, the world they met was culturally vastly different from Northern Europeans settling in Africa. Was an act of cultural displacement that involves what they call as insert dramatic call put in adjustments to and lands in which both our bloods and our habits change. The condition of living in a foreign culture combines with the difficulties and fluctuations of the slave trade. Long periods of inactivity punctuates by the brutality of the task of keeping people in prison in the dungeons, caused by psychological reactions that the men would have to overcome to survive on the coast. and later in the 1760s, Runer describes the men's reaction to encountering Africans. And this is what Runner said. When we first arrive in the land, it is as if we have come to another world. Everything is strange to us. We grieving and wish that we were forced to seek our daily food at every man's door, begging in Denmark, rather than to have to come to such a uncomfortable land. The food does not taste good to us, and we would rather starve than eat the food of the blacks. Of the blacks. Of the blacks. Now, mind you, these are a group of people back then, and maybe change up, but nothing different now. They didn't like food that black people made back then in the continent of Africa, New Guinean, west coast of Ivory Coast of Africa. Is you know why? Because we use spice. We use real food. We eat from the land. We eat the fruits. We hunt down those wild animals. We kill them. And we eat them up. And repair them. That's the difference between Africans, how we prepare food and make food, from the Europeans, how they prepare and make their food. Now, you always hear the rumor that most Europeans say they put some season now in certain parts of food, but majority of food, how they prepare and make it, is mostly bland. And it has to be bloody, for those who's not familiar. But they didn't like the food our people prepared back then in the 16 or 1700s. So keep that in mind. The blacks with whom we are to have close contacts are surely an evil people who seeks to cheat us or beg from us. Now, I understand why they don't have us understand Western history or world history, because this is in their literature and their writings. Now, I remember at one point when we were segregated and we had to start learning and make do with the books we have, we at least tell the honest truth about history. Now you have to be concerned about this thing about what do they call it, new thing now? A new thing they're trying to remove that, I don't know what they call it. If y'all know what it is, please leave in the comment sections. But let's keep going. I'm not going to keep long-winding this. Ronert tied the European rejection of African foods and mistrust of Africans in general to the fact that they had just arrived from Europe, and he drew a clear distinction between newly arrived Europeans and those who have been on the coast for a while. The differentiate indicates that the latter group had gone through a transition that made them more capable of living in Africa. After some time on the coast, the men initially mistrust and confused was replaced by attachment to new cultural context through friendships and initiate relations to members of the host culture. In this process, the Danish men adopted characteristics and habits from the Gaul and Akan people that were living among. They crossed over them and limited space of cultural transitions and reestablished themselves in Africa. Runer described this transition in life on the coast in detail. The first year after the men arrived was a trial to overcome, after which the men were integrated into coastal societies, beginning to like the foods and made friendship with themselves of the hostile cultures. If he lives longer than the 5 years, he learns to speak a little Negro Portuguese. See that? He then becomes adequate with a black in the town who becomes his friend and gives him advice for his benefit. Roner relates and he continues, yet we have almost no examples of them managing on their own earnings, something and returning to Europe. They wish to have one of the daughters of the country or keep a black mistress. One important difference between newly arrived men anxious and unsettling life on the coast and the life that the men who stayed long could achieve was, according to Roner, interpersonal relations with people in USA, and specifically imitate relations with African women. Further on in the Romer accounts, it becomes apparent that it was not a much a mistrust as wife the men were looking for, and when a man had stayed with his wife or with this wife a while, he cares as much for her and his children as a man does who has his true wife and children in Europe. Some among the Europeans do not wish to leave their families on the coast, even if they knew they could live better in Europe. What they call carceering with a man, or what they call carceering with a woman in Africa, have made them less homesick. And a Runer phrase, it's not a depressed to leave the country as before. Just as Edward Carcian mentioned in the introduction, felt at home at Christenberg only while was and distanced himself from both Africans and Europeans at the coast after her death. Many other Danish men remained culturally displaced until they entered into a relationship with a woman in Osa. This is not to suggest that the initial period of resettling in Africa only provokes what they call disability reactions. There also seems to have been a strong sense of liberation from European culture's restraints, particularly for men who stay only shorter periods on the coast. Sailors temporarily work and others short-term visitors when shape the social world in Osha by their lack of any what they call their standing of and associating with coastal life, and by speaking their spare time mirroring about Osha, drinking and having sex with women in town, lettering home and traveling accounts describe the great what they call maritime and parties at the fort, while court books from the secret council records when the rowdy behaviors lie to conflict and persist reports to the bishop and comprehend again an ungodly social life at the fort. Yet the equal importance in the overemphasize of the liberating aspects of culture displacement for Danish men living in Osha. For men who stayed longer than a few months on the coast, the physical instability and anxiety caused by cultural displacements were barriers that they need to overcome in order to resettle in Africa for long terms. For the men of Christenberg, resettling on the coast was not a simple act of arriving, but a mental and practical process of accepting food, language, and friendship. We should not, however, overstate the extent in which the Danish men were integrating in Gaul family in the early parts of the century. The separation of the sexes in Gaul family made it easy for them to accept Danish men into their kingship groups without fully integrating them. Though marrying a Gaul woman was a tremendous help for survival, reselling the trade relationships with the Danish men kept living at the fort, and they do not move into their wives' families' male compound, and they would have been obvious foreign in the African communities. They were therefore not so much assimilated into the Gaul community as they were allowed by the Gaul to resettle in Osha and have their presence accepted. The Khazarian marriage were therefore around are about much more than access to sex with African American. I'm sorry. Let's read that again. The Khazars' marriage were therefore about much more than access to sex with African women. Sexual encounters without Khazarians' marriage also took place. There are, for instance, cases of Danish men having sexual relations with enslaved women, working at the fort or imprisoned in the dungeon, which shows up in the source only because the sexual encounters led to a pregnancy or a child for whom a chaplain felt responsible. Now, we're going to put a footnote here. You know what's really interesting? That we here in America, we talk about shotgun marriage. Out here in the East Coast, back in the 1700s, sex has happened. A lot of European men had sex with African women under the rulership of men, African kings, leaders, etc. Because if we all know and understand African history or Africa right now as a whole, they were mostly kings and some queens. And I'll go further. There's no 50-50 between kings and queens in Africa like that. I mean, the queens ruled certain states before they were called countries when they were divided back in the late 1800s of parts of Africa. Most of Africa at the time was still run and controlled by men. We could say it could be a matriarchal or even run by a patriarch. Nonetheless, the men still run those parts of Africa. So there's no way hell no Europeans could sit there, just come in, eat up party land, have sex with your woman, and keep pushing. It don't go like that. And I'm not sure what part of history that a lot of men are going to try to put as propaganda by using Penelope Espin's book to say that these women sold out and were the major sold outs of black people during enslavement. And we're trying to go into the information and go into if this is a myth or a lie. And it seems to me it doesn't really prove factual because you always ask where is the source of these men are able to gain a foothold to have access to your women in return giving you goods. Should be the question we should be asked. Let's continue. In 1708, for example, Chaplain Anders Winters requests permission of Christian, a drummer, John Dawitt, who was a son of the fort slave and Danish employee in 1727, intern Governor Welsman wrote a former Governor Hendricks, one shown now at St. Thomas, that he, on behalf of son, had freed a fort slave named Melissa, because on the 12th or the 20th September, she gave birth to a fine mulatto boy who has been baptized and called Hendrik Adrian Christian. Both Shimon interest in the freeing of the woman named Massa and the fact that her child was given his first name Hendrik suggests that it was the former governor's son. A few sources also suggest that the men at Christiansburg used their superior position as jail keepers to sexually abuse enslaved people in prison in the dungeons. In one case, the abuse of a slave woman was mentioned in a border claim against Governor Warren for misusing his office while governor in the 1730s, where Governor Shieldrup implied that Warren has been involved in selling enslaved women specifically for sexual abuse. In a later case, Governor Jensen was accused of keeping a woman with him in his room at the fort for a few days and then sell her to a European slave ship. This incident surfaced in a company achieved only because the woman Jensen had sold was actually free, which led to an outcry from the woman's family. If Jensen had bought an already enslaved woman instead, there would have been no reason for Dane at Christenberg to record it. Danish men probably had sex with enslaved women more often than the company achieved suggestion. Yet, because sexual relations with women enslaved at the fort did not interfere with the trade or relationships of the people in Osha, there was no reason to mention them in the source, whereas customary marriage with free African women, so central to trade relations, come up more often. Let's pause right here. Let's pause right here. So these Danish European men were fucking the slave women and selling them, and doing things pretty much illegal during the so-called trade during them times. But it was not looked and was overlooked because some these women were slaves, so they were getting taken advantage out of their free will. Why is this man not talking about this? I thought they said that most of these women wanted it. Someone has some explaining to do. They're not really being honest with the history. They're not being really honest in the history at all. I thought these women were just laying on the feet of these foreign men. Some were free, but the majority of them were slaves. There was not no really 50-50 in regards to enslavement. Keep that in mind, people. Just keep that in mind. Let's continue. However, Kasari marriage may even have been about more than survival and trade. The exchange of amulets between Gal and Danish lovers, for instance, hint at the otherwise inaccessible emotional side of the relationship. Danish men order beautiful workers, key from Europeans to give to their loves in Osha, which in the West African context had been religious and emotionally significant. Keys and locks were understand and objects of empowerment, and particular padlocks with keys as evidence of desires made from inserted pegs or keys and holes or locks had spiritual significance of enclosure and protection, empowering and wearing of the keys. Likewise, Lockwick's rumor described how some of the men at Christenberg wore amulets under their clothing, occasionally seen by roommates that they had been asked to wear by their mistress, which were supposed to be good for that perhaps that their wives and lovers were giving them amulets to protect them from contracting or contracting disease. In any case, combined with the reference of to how much European men loved their African wives and children and how strongly they felt connected to their new homes in Africa and such exchange, the keys of amulets are wearing might be indicated by real attachments between hundreds and wives, or actually between husbands and wives, in an otherwise very particular arrangement. Emotional aside, the Kasari marriage were undeniable practice, and since both Gal and Dane had interest in the marriage, the Kasari institutions could function as a central cultural meeting point. Gal and Khan, Danes, and other Europeans and Africans knew and accept marriage as a social institution. They also all seem to have accepted marriage as a system of exchange, since marriage entails a transfer of goods and others and or service, but apart from the direct payments involved in entertaining a marriage contract, the union had broadened economic functions as the primary institution for wealth and properly distribute between generations and as the basis for the division of labor between the sexes. Moreover, West African trades was organized through conjugal relationships, which meant the connection formed between wives and husband and trading families were just as much trading partners as family ties. Make sure you like the stream and share this too. A brief commercial basis. Continuing. Interracial marriage institutions like the Khazar marriage that developed in the Gold Coast and in other parts of West Africa were common throughout the early modern world. Whenever European trade, marriage was an important procreative, sexual, emotional, and economic social institution that could be recognized across cultural differences on the middle grounds that trading demand. They officially recognize rights and duties for the married couple, determine the status of the offspring born to a couple, and tie groups of people together in large alliance. Whether the contracts were negotiated between kingship, group, patriarchy, families, and or individuals. No, surprisingly, the institution therefore played an important part in the history of European expansion. European traders in many parts of the world discovered that settled with a woman from the local trading population could be of great importance in foreign culture, diplomats, and political connections in recognition of the threat that such connection could pose to colonial control. Interracial marriage was often one of the first social practices to be banned when an area was colonized by Europeans. We're going to highlight that right there. Matter of fact, let's read that again for those in the back. Okay, I didn't hear this in the back. In recognition of the threat that such connections could pose to colonial control, interracial marriage was often one of the first social practices to be banned when an area was colonized by Europeans. And we're going to put another side note here. Important. And that's important to know that. That's very important to know that. Because everywhere they go, they have to put bans. Put things to what my good friend, or what they call like the another consequence saying that is that racially tailoring and sex guarding or mate guarding their position, the Europeans. So there's truth into what the man said or the brother said on the channel, which y'all know who I'm talking about, Mr. Browner. In the French plan to turn the fur trading enterprise in Louisiana into an agricultural colony in the early 18th century, for example, the idea was to supply the French farmers with European women to avoid country marriage, which, according to the French authors, kept the men from settling down and therefore preventing the establishment of a stable and self-sufficient colony. Likewise, when English colonization reached Western Canada, it was followed by European women missionaries and agriculture, with a few decades of interracial marriage was regarded as immoral and with the time become illegal. In India, interracial relationships were also in some extent encouraged before English colonization. In the 18th century, the ideal English company's officials was affluent diplomats who had equal goods rationale with Indians and European officials and strong knowledge of Indian culture. Cohabitation with Indian women was considered sophisticated and what they call cosmopolitan or cosmopolitan. In the 19th century, as the English colonizer of India intensified, the idea of English officials changed. How now had to be an ambassador for English culture, representing and living by imperial example with the European wife and children. Interracial families were always consist to question amongst English in India as they intersect with racial hierarchies, and their children inhabits ambiguous positions in the social order. Let me do a quick checkup right now, guys. Okay, I'm just doing a quick checkup because almost at the end of this. And take a quick little breather. You know how I do it. I'm just doing something. And I'm just checking something right now, guys. All right. We could continue. All right, let's continue, guys. Cultural mixing and trading posts following logic and power dynamics that often ran counters of colonial interests. European traders depend on the goodwill and interests of their trading partners, and it would, for example, never have been easy for Europeans to take their children away from the local families. In West Africa, where Europeans were situated or stationed at their fort only with the permission of African rulers, cultural transmission and mixing was much more likely to happen on Africa rather than European terms. Yet in both colonial and trading posts, interracial marriage imitates mixing, and the result, children of mixed descendants function as a catalyst for generational common practice around racial differences. So there's benefit when Europeans come here and screw your women and breed them up and have children. Keep that in mind, fellas. Initially, negotiations over difference in interracial families in the early modern Atlantic world primarily following lines of gender, class, and age hierarchies that in different forms of specific were recognized in most cultures. As they encountered and sought to understand each other, people from different groups recognized gender and class difference in the mode of dress, occupation, and behaviors, and they use these recognizable signs of difference to communicate and understand each other across cultural differences. At times, European misunderstand or misunderstood cultural communications, ascribing to the wrong meaning to gestures and behaviors. They then, though they recognize a similar or even identical to their own, yet even perceived similarities had the potential for opening up communication and interaction in the initial encounters that took place in the cross-cultural marriage. Gender and class play important roles in creating a shared space of perceive and recognize similar. Both sides recognize the marriage institution, but they also of importance agree on gender and class, assigning different rules or different roles, occupation, and social place for men and women. The Gal and Danes were both accustomed to thinking of difference between people and hierarchy. What do you call it? Inheritable bonds and cultural heritage, language, cultural, and marriage, culture, and so on. And they share assumptions about gender and class that help them recognize each other social hierarchies. They agreed that women and men were expected to fill different roles in society, and they agreed to women were subordinate to men. They share assumptions that wealth and occupations were measured of prestige that signal distinction of the town on the Gold Coast were stratified by wealth and occupation long before the Danes arrived. All along the Gold Coast, town population consists of distinct and varied occupations groups: traders, fishermen, priests, military men, what they call asafo, and so on. Indistinguished between different groups in the coastal towns, wealth and culture markets associated with wealth were of paramount importance. The Danes came from a solid straffal kingdom of landed gentry and what they call commerce, and could easily recognize social difference along lines of wealth and occupations. Breathe now, breathe. Danes and Gals also share an understanding that wealth, prestige, and freedom were inseparable. Links to Danes at Christenberg had not grown up in a Saki or a society with slaves, but they would have been quite accessible, astonished, to only a few people in society, having the freedom to travel or more as they wish. Throughout the Middle Age, there were strict rules regarding of the people who could travel and more and move away from the land they live and work on. Their labor in part belongs to the proprietors who was responsible for the collection of the king's taxes from individual farmers, families, and areas of control. In 1733, these regulations were reinstated in a provision that prohibits all men and boys between 14 and 13, or actually 14 to 34, later between 4 and 40, from leaving the land that they were born and without an explicit purpose, as well as permission from their landed proprietaries. Thus, when the Danish men arrived in Africa, they would have recognized that some people were more free than others, and that social status decides one opportunity in life. Such distinctions were intensified important in the Atlantic slave trades, which depend on defining and maintaining social difference between people who were enslaved and people who were not for sale to European ships on the Gold Coast. And as in all societies with slave, distinctions between slaves and non-slaves had developed over the course of centuries. To the Gal and Akan, distinctions between slaves and non-slave following the lines of both ethnic difference and social class. People who had the social status of slaves in Gold Coast societies were most often from different ethnic groups than their owners, whether they had been born on the coast of slave parents or had been brought to as one of the slave markets in the northern parts of present day Ghana. And fourth in hand, and there's a map of it. There's a picture of a map actually. And Asante, as well as Twa Odawa, used in the means of slave, literally means foreigner who have been brought, and more specifically, a person from the north from tribal markets in terms of carrying and still carrying. Very negative connotations that it got also adopted Twa and Aduko and designate slave from the north, while the other slaves were called what they call us? Nayun. Nayun. For the God difference between those of were in the sales to European ships and those were the different essentials of ethnic distinctions. All right, almost down the wire with this one. Let me do this. All right. Okay. Enslaved people were considered strangers. Let's read it again. Enslaved people were considered strangers. And whenever they had been born slaves or brought later on in life, they did not have the same rights as other members of the kingship group, and they worked for. They were in some extent integrated into these kingship groups, but they did not belong to a family lineage. They had the lowest status in society. Only though adoption or marriage could slaves become full members of the family they worked for. Even then, they might had little chance of passing on as freedom. And particularly slaves who had recently arrived from the north were easily recognized and were thought to be distinguished from other people by both physical and cultural characteristics. During this Atlantic slave trade, Danish traders at Christiansborg most often followed these Gold Coast distinctions between people who were for sale to European ships and people who were not. Danish traders understood distinctions between enslaved people from the north and people living in coast, and they knew that the people who did not have the status of slave were to stay in the country. But lines between slaves and enslaved were not always so easily drawn. While the boundaries between those who did and who did not have the social status of slave, the soon was clear that there was another more varied group, human pawn, who sometimes also end up as Europeans' slave ships. A pawn might, like a slave, for a creditor for many years, for a whole lifetime, if a debt was not paid, but pawns continued to belong to the kingship group they were born into. They had the status of free people. European forts in the Gold Coast pawned an increased number of free Africans during Atlantic slave trade, which gave European traders a powerful hold on African families, a dynamic we return to in more detail in chapter 4, which I can't wait. In the social climate of the Atlantic slave trade, particularly as it intensifies over the course of the 18th century, social difference between slaves and non-slaves in OSA were gradually rationalized as generalization of Gallic and Danish traders intermarried and produced new people and new meaning. They developed a common language and set the practice organized around rational difference, rational distinctions between European Africans and other Africans were never the only difference at work in defining social distinctions in OSHA class. Gender and other hierarchies of differences remain important, but they were all embedded in the same Atlantic world, where race was gaining strength in the 18th century. The growing group of Euro-African took advantage of the space that rationalized difference had created developed a hybrid culture that was specifically adapted to the traders. And this discourse of rational difference were readily available in the Atlantics world, and the Danish and Gaul slave traders and also developed their practice around racial difference. They drew on these Atlantic meanings attached by the racial difference. When Gaul and Dane employed the Portuguese lingo, façon, of the coast, they simultaneously adopted centuries of Portuguese experience in racialistic thinking, rationalistic actually. When Danes from Danes from the beginning reference to the Africans as Negroes or blacks, and the Europeans as Blanca, derived from the Portuguese blanco instead of the Danish word white. What they call I think it's called Hivi. They were participating in a large Atlantic discourse attaching meaning to racial differences. Even before the early 18th century, a central feature of rationalized discourse was the linking of slavery and blackness and Danish embeddedness in this discourse. As perhaps most starkly expressed, the Danish practice of reference to certain Africans as free blacks or free Negroes. If free meant not enslaved, then everybody of the coast who did not have the status of a slave was free. Got it? Why then would it be necessary for the Danes to draw attention to the fact that certain Africans were not enslaved? Permissible either by Danes or Christianberg had adopted the practice of referring a African who were not enslaved as free from the plantation colonies in the in the Americans, or they had bought it with their home or bought them from home. In the collective pool of knowledge in the overseas trade circles of Copenhagen, slave trading planters and administrators could easily share experience and expectations from Africans, Asians, and Americans. Traders and colonists often came from the same families and they had much opportunity to learn from each other. In Copenhagen, however, the practice emerged in suggesting that in the eyes of the Danes, all Africans were potentially enslaved, making it worthy of note when Africans were free. Though these early Northern European traders made reference to rationalized difference, they do not seem to have had a very clear sense of what racial difference meant to how flexible racial characteristics should be understood. Descriptions of West African women in traveling accounts from around 1700s show European grappling with and sometimes change their opinions about bodily racial difference in the 17th century traveling accounts depicting Africans women as monstrous, physically different from European women. Let us highlight that for a second. And let's read that again. Europeans grapple with and sometimes change their opinions about the bodily racial difference. In the 17th century, travel accounts depict African women as monstrous, physically different from European women, whereas 18th century accounts describe African women as remarkable, similar to European women physically. Indeed, as terms of the 18th century, West African women were sometimes depicted as some similar to European women that European men could choose to ignore. So what they mean by this, I'll tell you what they mean by this. Either two things that comes to mind in my mind, that the women a century ago, 17, what is it? Going on to 1800, I think. 17th to 18th century. You must understand, a lot of European men interbreed with a lot of African women, and it changed the genetic makeup of some of the African women. That's why you can see certain African women in the East Coast, Africa, Ghana, Ivory Coast. Some of them will look a little light shade because they were interbred by the Europeans. So by default, if they had not really much round shape, because mostly you think about African women back then and now, not a lot of us were big and fat, were voluptuous. Very few women. You see voluptuous now because the diet has been adulterated with foreign invaders. It is what it is. I know people are going to get mad at me saying that, but if we were all big and when we were always BBLs, big, like thick, super thick, then that would have been the case. But, but it's the information was given here, it says otherwise. Let's keep going. And the skin color in the dark. In the Frenchman Jean Barpin accounts from 1679, for instance, the women he met in Akura were beautiful, dressed, good humor, and skillful in the arts of seducting or seducing European men. Interesting. Let's read that again. In the Frenchman Jean Barbot accounts From 1679, for instance, the women he met in Accra were beautifully dressed, good humor, and skillful in the art of seducing European men. Interesting. I saw several of them richly adorish in such manner as might prove significant tempting to many lewd Europeans who not regard complexion, said all cats are gray in the dark. Skin color was not a mark of essential difference under certain sexualizing circumstance. It was easily ignored. As you know, most women at the time were not that fat either. So if you're dark and your body is slim, the Europeans might deal with you. Let's move on. These unsettled meaning of racial difference are similar evidence in Chaplin, Jonan's, Rask travel accounts. Rask stayed at the fort from 1708 to 1713, and his accounts sit in the transition period between the early modern views of African as the domain of witches and cannibals and the better informed and more self-confident travels accounts of the 18th century. Rask often quote travel accounts from the 17th century, but usually to correct them. For example, he observed that West African women breasts did not sag as much as rumor it had it. I have not even anywhere on the Gold Coast such ugly, extraordinary hanging breasts as Dapper described, apart from two or three at Del Mina, but in general they have well-shaped, moderate hanging breasts. Now, what he means by this, now depending on the age of these women, if you look at back then, in certain parts of Africa, women didn't wear bras. They, the most you might see most African women up until the colonization of Africa, they're now dressed in now because of the infection of the Europeans. Because the Europeans, as you know, history, they sit there and see most of our women were pretty much half naked, mostly, or majority. And they want to sit there and have their way with the women because they're exposed, because they have a certain desire and lust that imprint and psychologically damage a whole portion of African people, not only in the continent, but nationwide. And I could say it goes even further in the epigenetic side of things. Let's go. Let's continue. Rask discussed a number of 17th century understand of the skin color and healed them up against what the contradictory explanations as if he was not quite sure which leg to stand on. For example, Rask recount the African babies were almost white, white, white when they were born, but then the babies were smeared with palm oil or talon, into which has been mixed cold or soaked and lay in the sun for about 14 days. But then to the following sentence, Rask contradicts himself by adding that African babies would also have become black without being smeared or smeared. Negroes or the blacks cannot give birth to white children whenever in the world they live. So the blackness of their skin does not come from the great heat of the sun. Why should African families then go through the trouble of smearing them with laying them out in the sun for 2 weeks? The contradiction suggests that Rask could not quite believe either the black skin was produced of as a product of culture or that the babies were born with black skin. And I'll tell you the answer, because our children, even at them, they were not miscegenated with these, people would have ivory colored dark skin on the average. And in some parts of Africa, some even blue black if you travel, which I always advocate people should travel to the continent. It's a beautiful country. I would like to travel. there as well. Ra's uncertainty about the nature of persistence of skin color also came out in discussion of the color of children of mixed race heritage. Black skin, or we call black skin, seems to disappear quickly when white men had children with black women. When a what they call subject at Cape Coast had two daughters with a woman of mixed Euro African heritage. They were so beautiful, white, and well shaped as they had been born in London on the oldest English. Now, March, these are mulatto. These are part of offsprings of another a mulatto. A white man had procreated with a mulatto woman, a mixed Euro African heritage. So they always talk about this one drop rule. I'm sorry, and ancestry to end that sentence. The one drop rule is not really that really strong. Once you start mixing it in. So when you hear these dumb dudes talking about the seed and all this nonsense, they're saying that because they just want to have interracial sex with non-black women. This is that simple. You're not preserving. You're diluting, and you're going to erase your genetics. I seen some man had a child with non-black woman. I think the woman's probably Hispanic, white, mostly white, and his child does not look nothing like. He looks like most. And the reason why that is because you already have certain part of admixture with Europeans already. So let's continue. In Copenhagen, Rask had also encountered a young student, Verville, who was the son of a white man and a black woman, who could pass at white. According to Rask, Verville's skin was somewhat dark, but not darker than many people with two white parents. And if one did not know that his mother was black, one would not guess it. Rask made sure to emphasize that this quick disappearance of black skin could happen only when white men had children with black women, and not when black men had children with white women, which probably back then you're going to have a tan. See, the problem with reading this, y'all got to understand, once you start interracial mix, your children's going to have what we call the 50-50, and depending on the admixture and what they come out, they might have or look more like you on that side or look more like the mother or another race of person. Either or, your children are not going to look like they're a byproduct of another whole race of person. And depending on who you breed or you have sex and you copulate with someone that's non-black, your children might come out damn near white and no one will recognize it if careful. Where was I? The whitening of white men children was, of course, also more relevant and important to Rask and other European men in these trading posts, where there were very few white women, and those who were present were married to white men. The uncertainty about the meaning and persistence of skin color meant that any social distinction European attached to your African collective were relatively flexible, and not that they did not attach negative sentiments to Negroes or blacks. Rask, for one, described most West African he met in very negative terms, but like skin color, such racial characteristics were present and malleable with class, education, and Christianity. Verville could easily pass and comprehend, and in a similar way, Africans in Osha were to be judged by their class and their connection to Europeans, and later also their Christianity and education, at least as much as by the skin color as in other areas of the Atlantic world. In early modern periods, Danish men appeared to have arrived in Africa with relatively vague and messy notions of what racial difference meant. Their large, undifferent categories of blacks, was not yet as full of meaning nor as rigid as it would become over the following century. Even though skin color and physical difference between people from different parts of the world have been studied and interpreted for centuries before any of the fourth of the Gold Coast were established. The Danish traders and Christenberg still arrived with relatively undefined and loose ideas of what racial difference between Europeans and Africans should mean. Unlike the Portuguese and the Spanish, who already had centuries of experience trading with Africans and buying, selling, and owning African slaves, hear that, had not or had next to no experience with Africans that would lead them to turn them ideally about racial difference into social practice. Even more important, these loose ideals encounter Gold Coast social hierarchies based on conception of ethnics and class. The difference that had developed over centuries and were therefore much more solidified and not spiritly Gold Coast social hierarchies become more immediate important in defining difference in the slave trade. However, the Danes and Gaul intermarriage and trades of vague and unclear understanding of racial difference slowly solidify and become the base for the social hierarchy along racial lines. This process of developing social distinctions along lines of race and was guided by the unequal power distinctions in the Atlantic world. As the Atlantic colonial systems emphasize and strengthen racial difference, everything Europeans gain value, market, or belongs to or associated with the real beneficiaries of the colonial Atlantic system drew their prestige from the Atlantic world of Europeans, of which Europeans and Africans live in unequal terms, and two commercial systems that encounters one other in the Atlantic slave trade were never equally powerful. And seen from the Atlantic perspective, Africans and Europeans did not have the same opportunities to benefit from colonial systems that the slave trade was a part of. In West Africa, encountering around the slave trade, Africans had more influence in everything from daily trade transactions to smaller and larger political conflict, but the European slave trades represent a much larger colonial enterprise, one whose power and persistence did not hinge directly on what kind or what happens in the local slave trade business. When Danish men died or were sent back to Denmark, new people were sent out. The Danish slave trade was part of a colonial system, which over the course of 18th century will become more and more profitable as sugar products in the Danish West Indies and St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John took off, unlike African traders in Osha and Danish traders shared a powerful sense of encounter of economic and political security. This was the large power hierarchies that Euro-Africans and Osha would position themselves in to take advantage of, as we will see in the following chapters. Euro-Africans and Osha were, of course, not alone in taking advantage of the power structure of Atlantic colonial systems. Individuals on all sides of the Atlantic respond to the opportunities and presence of the colonial system of Europeans were better positioned than anybody else to take advantage of the economic opportunities. France boys, for example, managed to draw the resource or on resource on family relations in several corners of the Atlantic world, which situated him well to succeed in Atlantic trade. He was still a young man, as we know, when he was Khazarian to Cocoa and continued to build on his connection in Africa, but he could also draw a connection to the Danish fort of Europe during the Cinque stay in Europe. In 1710, he had married an Englishwoman, Joanna Smith, who was a sister of an officer of the customs house in London. When he returned to Ostia as a governor of Christiansburg in 1711, he was an experienced slave trader who could maneuver in both Europe, Africa, slave trade circles, and he did not very well for himself until was accused of private trading and called back in Copenhagen. In 1770, even after that, he returned to Africa in 1720 in an employ of the British Royal Africans Company, perhaps based on family connection in London. In the local context of the Gold Coast, Africans and European Africa set terms for initiating the Khazarian marriage, but the practice was also shaped by the large Atlantic colonial system that the slave trade was part of. In the large world, Africans did not set the term for the mixing of cultures. In the large world, Europeans were positioned much better and take advantage of opportunities opened by colonialism and slave trade. We see the unequal conditions for participation in Atlantic colonial systems. When we compare France Boy and Coco Oshun, was France Boy what they call benefiting both from the Khazarian marriage and from the position as a European man in the large Atlantic world. Coco and her kin benefit opportunities of the slave trade were restricted in their local worlds. When Coco's father became Cobrasian in 1711, he began receiving monthly payments from the fort and promised to trade primarily with them. As a generation passed, a number of slave trading families like Tata Oshun would develop close ties with the Danes, and they would in turn benefit more than other Africans from the trade. They did not gain as much from the slave trade as inland killing kings who could claim all captives taken in war as their property as sell these captives in Europe. Slave trades, but what they call copsiers also secured profits from the trade for themselves and their families. In return of these profits, African families established strong ties to European forts. They began to develop debts to the companies. In fact, the last time Coco Oshun is mentioned in the Danish source in the four of debts of eight, what they call rigideros, owners of the government, warriors, and assistants, sparing in 1735. That's the end. I mean, there's no sound. There should be some sound. Hold on. 1 second, guys. Some sound. Yeah, there's sound. You might catch playback, bro. All right, that ends this chapter. Chapter 2 of chapter 1. I think it's called the setup. Yeah. So, how are we gonna move forward with this book? I'm gonna have to find some ways to get the PDF of this book, if possible. Not, I'll continue the track I am with this book. This is a good read. This is a good book. In conclusion of this, and let me make some highlights here. Hold on, guys. Yeah, there was some things in this chapter. Should I highlight? But I'll close it here. Man, I hope y'all enjoyed this stream. Like I said, I've been looking forward for your comments for the stream. I also have another book in stores with this one. I might do 2 different books to cover more ground on 2 different topics. I'm still thinking on that. To draw in more of the point of what I'm trying to get at. But overall, with this chapter, the setup is laying out the foundation now of what is to come moving forward in the books called The Daughters of the Trade. We're going to look and see if this is really true evidence, because the question should be asked: if the black woman was, if anyone could, let's say this, have the problems like they say they do, and say the black woman was the cause of the downfall of black in every aspect, including history, we're gonna put this on trial and go for the information at hand to find if this is valid. And so far, 2 chapters, a whole chapter into it, there's no really evidence, serious evidence about this. Because if this is true, how were these European able to get a footnote where by law it say they have some arrangement with the African continent, with certain parts of Africa, to do trade and trade with women and with the slaves as well. So move forward, we're gonna go more deep into this chapters and break down this and see all what has been said about women's role in this. Is it really valid? And the real intention of Miss Penn's S. Penn's writing of this book. So that is it. To anyone that's new, if you want to subscribe to Zero Ends channel, you know what to do. Hit the red button and hit the top notification bell for the uploads and live streams here on Zero Ends channel. And that's all the links. I'll see you again soon, guys. Take care.